Chapter 56. Every time I met President Lincoln, I wondered how such elevation of thought and such childish simplicity could be found in the same man. After my interviews with him many times, I said to myself, how can this rail-splitter have so easily raised himself to the highest range of human thought and philosophy? The secret was that Lincoln had spent a great part of his life at the school of Christ, and that he meditated his sublime teachings to an extent unsuspected by the world. I found in him the most perfect type of Christianity I ever met. Professedly, he was neither a strict Presbyterian, nor a Baptist, nor a Methodist, but he was the embodiment of all of which is more perfect and Christian in them. His religion was the very essence of what God wants in man. It was from Christ himself he had learned to love God and his neighbor, as it was from Christ he had learned the dignity and the value of man. Ye are all brethren, the children of God, was his great motto. It was from the gospel that he had learned his principles of equality, fraternity, and liberty. As it was from the gospel he had learned that sublime childish simplicity which, alone and forever, won the admiration and affection of all. I could cite many facts to illustrate this, but I will give only one taken from the memoirs of Mr. Bateman, Superintendent of Public Instruction from the state of Illinois. Mr. Lincoln paused for long minutes, his features supercharged with emotion. Then he rose and walked up and down the reception room in the effort to retain or regain his self-possession. Stopping at last, he said with a trembling voice and his cheeks wet with tears, I know there is a God, and that he hates injustice and slavery. I see the storm coming, and I know that his hand is in it. If he has a place and a work for me, and I think he has, I believe I am ready. I am nothing, but the truth is everything. I know I am right, because I know that liberty is right, for Christ teaches it, and Christ is God. I have told them that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and Christ and reason say the same thing. Douglas does not care whether slavery is voted up or down. But God cares, and humanity cares, and I care. And with God's help, I will not fail. I may not see the end, but it will come, and I shall be vindicated. And those men will see that they have not read their Bible right. Does it not appear strange that men could ignore the moral aspect of this contest? A revelation could not make it plainer to me that slavery or the government must be destroyed. The future would be something awful as I look at it, but for this rock on which I stand, alluding to the gospel he still held in his hand. It seems as if God had borne with slavery until the very teachers of religion had come to defend it from the Bible and to claim for it a divine character and sanction. And now the cup of iniquity is full, and the vials of wrath will be poured out. Mr. Bateman adds, after this, the conversation was continued for a long time. Everything he said was of a very deep, tender, and religious tone, and all was tinged with a touching melancholy. After further reference to a belief in divine providence and the fact of God in history, the conversation turned upon prayer. He freely stated his belief in the duty, privilege, and efficacy of prayer, and he intimated, in no unmistakable terms, that he had sought in that way the divine guidance and favor. The effect of this conversation upon the mind of Mr. Bateman, a Christian gentleman whom Mr. Lincoln profoundly respected, was to convince him that Mr. Lincoln had, in his quiet way, found a path to the Christian standpoint, that he had found God, and rested on the eternal truth of God. As the two men were about to separate, Mr. Bateman remarked, I had not supposed that you were accustomed to think so much upon this class of subject. Certainly your friends generally are ignorant of the sentiments you have expressed to me. He quickly replied, I know they are, but I think more on these subjects than upon all others, and I have done so for years, and I am willing you should know it. More than once I felt as if I were in the presence of an old prophet, when listening to his views about the future destinies of the United States. In one of my last interviews with him, I was filled with an admiration which it would be difficult to express when I heard the following views and predictions. It was with the Southern leaders of this Civil War, as with the big and small wheels of our railroad cars. Those who ignore the laws of mechanics are apt to think that the large, strong, and noisy wheels they see are the motive power. But they are mistaken. The real motive power is not seen. It is noiseless and well concealed in the dark behind its iron walls. The motive power are the few well-concealed pails of water, heated into steam, which is itself directed by the noiseless, small, but unerring engineer's finger. The common people see and hear the big, noisy wheels of the Southern Confederacy's cars. They call them Jeff Davis, Lee, Toombs, Beauregard, Semmes, etc. But they honestly think they are the motive of power, the first cause of our troubles. But this is a mistake. The true motive power is secret behind the thick walls of the Vatican, the colleges and schools of the Jesuits, the convents of the nuns, and the confessional boxes of Rome. There is a fact which is too much ignored by the American people, and with which I am acquainted only since I became president. It is that the best and leading families of the South have received their education in great part, if not in whole, from the Jesuits and the nuns. Hence those degrading principles of slavery, pride, cruelty, which are as a second nature among many of those people. Hence that strange want of fair play, humanity, that implacable hatred against the ideas of equality and liberty as we find them in the gospel of Christ. You do not ignore that the first settlers of Louisiana, Florida, New Mexico, Texas, South California, and Missouri were Roman Catholics, and that their first teachers were Jesuits. It is true that those states have been conquered or bought by us since. But Rome had put the deadly virus of her anti-social and anti-Christian maxims into the veins of the people before they became American citizens. Unfortunately, the Jesuits and the nuns have in great part remained the teachers of those people since. They have continued in a silent but efficacious way to spread their hatred against our institution, our laws, our schools, our rights, and our liberties, in such a way that this terrible conflict became unavoidable between the North and the South. As I have told you before, it is to popery that we owe this terrible civil war. I would have laughed at the man who would have told me that before I became the president, but Professor Morris has opened my eyes on the subject. Now I see that mystery. I understand that engineering of hell, which, though not seen or even suspected by the country, is putting in motion the large, heavy, and noisy wheels of the state cars of the Southern Confederacy. Our people are not yet ready to learn and believe those things, and perhaps it is not the proper time to initiate them to these dark mysteries of hell. It would throw oil on a fire which is already sufficiently destructive. You are almost the only one with whom I speak freely on that subject. But sooner or later, the nation will know the real origin of those rivers of blood and tears which are spreading desolation and death everywhere. And those who have caused those desolations and disasters will be called to give an account of them. Many of those who approached Abraham Lincoln felt that there was a prophetic spirit in him, and that he was continually walking and acting with the thought of God in his mind, and only in view to do his will and work for his glory. Speaking of slaves, he said one day before the members of his cabinet, "I have not decided against the proclamation of liberty to the slaves, but I hold the matter under advisement, and I can assure you that the subject is on my mind, by day and by night, more than any other. Whatever shall appear to be God's will, I will do." A few days before that proclamation, he said before several of his counselors, "I made a solemn vow before God that if General Lee was driven back from Pennsylvania, I would crown the result by the declaration of freedom to the slaves. But I would have volumes to write instead of a short chapter, were I to give all the facts I have collected of the sincere, profound piety of Abraham Lincoln. I cannot, however, omit his admirable and solemn act of faith in the eternal justice of God, as expressed in the closing words of his last inaugural address of the 4th of March, 1865. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." These sublime words, falling from the lips of the greatest Christian whom God ever put to the head of a nation, only a few days before his martyrdom, sent a thrill of wonder through the whole world. The 6th of April, 1865, President Lincoln was invited by General Grant to enter Richmond, the capital of the rebel states which had just been captured. The 9th, the beaten army of Lee, surrounded by the victorious legions of soldiers of liberty, were forced to lay down their arms and their banners at the feet of the generals of Lincoln. The 10th, the victorious president addressed an immense multitude of the citizens of Washington, to invite them to thank God and the armies of the glorious victories of the last few days, and for the blessed peace which was to follow these 5 years of slaughter. But he was on top of that mountain of Pisgah, and though he had fervently prayed that he might cross the Jordan and enter with his people into the land of promise, after which he had so often sighed, he was not to see his request granted. The answer had come from heaven. You will not cross the Jordan, and you will not enter that promised land, which is there, so near. You must die for your nation's sake. The lips, the heart, and the soul of the new Moses were still repeating the sublime words, "The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether," when the Jesuit assassin, Booth, murdered him the 14th of April, 1865, at 10 o'clock p.m. Let us hear the eloquent historian, Abbott, on that sad event. In the midst of unparalleled success, and while all the bells of the land were ringing with joy, a calamity fell upon us which overwhelmed the country in consternation and awe. On Friday evening, April 14th, President Lincoln attended Ford's Theater in Washington. He was sitting quietly in his box listening to the drama, when a man entered the door by the lobby leading to the box, closing the door behind him. Drawing near to the president, he drew from his pocket a small pistol and shot him in the back of the head. As the president fell, senseless and mortally wounded, and the shriek of his wife, who was seated at his side, pierced every ear, the assassin leaped from the box, a perpendicular height of 9 feet, and as he rushed across the stage, bareheaded, brandishing a dagger, exclaimed, "Sic semper tyrannis," and disappeared behind the side scenes. There was a moment of silent consternation. Then ensued a scene of confusion, which it is in vain to attempt to describe. The dying president was taken into a house nearby and placed upon a bed. What a scene did that room present! The chief of a mighty nation lay there, senseless, drenched in blood, his brains oozing from his wound. Sumner, Farwell, and Colfax and Stanton, and many others were there, filled with grief and consternation. The surgeon, General Barnes, solemnly examined the wound. There was silence as of the grave. The life and death of the nation seemed dependent on the result. General Barnes looked up sadly and said, "The wound is mortal." "Oh no, General, no, no!" cried out Secretary Stanton, and sinking into a chair, he covered his face and wept like a child. Senator Sumner tenderly held the head of the unconscious martyr. Though all unused to weep, he sobs as though his great heart would break. In his anguish, his head falls upon the blood-stained pillow, and his black locks blend with those of the dying victim, which care and toil has rendered gray, and which blood has crimsoned. What a scene! What a scene! Sumner, who had lingered through the months of agony, having himself been struck down by the bludgeon of slavery, now sobbing and fainting in anguish over the prostrate form of his friend, whom slavery had slain. This vile rebellion, after deluging the land in blood, has culminated in a crime which appalls all nations. Noble Abraham, true descendant of the father of the faithful, honest in every trust, humble as a child, tender-hearted as a woman, who could not bear to injure even his most envenomed foes, who, in the hour of triumph, was saddened lest the feelings of his adversaries should be wounded by their defeat. With charity for all, malice towards none, endowed with a common sense, intelligence never surpassed, and with power of intellect, which enabled him to grapple with the most gigantic opponents in debates, developing abilities as a statesman, which won the gratitude of his country and the admiration of the world, and with graces and amiability, which drew to him all generous hearts, dies by the bullet of the assassin. But who was that assassin? Booth was nothing but a tool of the Jesuits. It was Rome who directed his arm after corrupting his heart and damning his soul. After I had mixed my tears with those of the grand country of my adoption, I fell on my knees and asked my God to grant me to show to the world what I knew to be the truth, that horrible crime was the work of popery. And after 20 years of constant and most difficult researches, I come fearlessly today before the American people to say and prove that the President, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated by the priests and the Jesuits of Rome. In the book of the testimonies given in the prosecution of the assassination of Lincoln, published by Ben Pittman, and in the 2 volumes of the trial of John Surratt in 1867, we have the legal and irrefutable proof that the plot of the assassins of Lincoln was matured, if not started, in the house of Mary Surratt, 561 H Street, Washington, D.C. The sworn testimonies show that this was the common rendezvous of the priests of Washington. What does the presence of so many priests in that house reveal to the world? No man of common sense who knows anything about the priests of Rome can doubt that they were the advisors and counselors, the very soul of that infernal plot. Those priests who were the personal friends and the father confessors of Booth, John Surratt, Mrs. and Miss Surratt, could not be constantly there without knowing what was going on, particularly when we know that every one of those priests was a rabid rebel in heart. Every one of those priests, knowing that his infallible Pope had called Jeff Davis his dear son and had taken the Southern Confederacy under his protection, was bound to believe that the most holy thing a man could do was to fight for the Southern cause by destroying those who were its enemies. Read the history of the assassination of Admiral Coligny, Henry III, and Henry IV, and William the Taciturn by the hired assassins of the Jesuits. Compare them with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and you will find that one resembles the other like 2 drops of water. You will understand that they all come from the same source, Rome. The murderers, selected and trained by the Jesuits, were the most exalted Roman Catholic piety, living in the company of priests, going to confess very often, receiving the communion the day before, if not the very day of the murder. You will see that the assassins were considering themselves the chosen instruments of God to save the nation by striking its tyrant, and that they firmly believed that there was no sin in killing the enemy of the people, of the Holy Church, and the infallible Pope. Booth, suffering the most horrible tortures from his broken leg, writes in his daily memorandum the very day before his death, "I can never repent, though we hated to kill. Our country owed all her troubles to him, Lincoln, and God simply made the instrument of his punishment." Who can suppose that it was Jeff Davis who had filled the mind and the heart of Booth with that religious and exalted fanaticism? Surely Jeff Davis had promised money to arm their nerves by the hope of becoming rich. The testimonies on that account say that he had promised $1 million. The arch-rebel could give the money, but the Jesuits alone could select the assassins, train them, and show them a crown of glory in heaven if they would kill the author of the bloodshed and famous renegade and apostate, the enemy of the Pope and the Church, Lincoln. Who does not see the lessons given by the Jesuits to Booth in their daily intercourse in Mary Surratt's house when he reads those lines written by Booth a few hours before his death? "I can never repent. God made me the instrument of his punishment." Compare these words with the doctrines and principles taught by the councils, the decrees of the Pope, and the laws of Holy Inquisition, and you will find that the sentiments and belief of Booth flow from those principles as the river flows from its source. And that pious Miss Surratt, who the very next day after the murder of Lincoln said, without being rebuked in the presence of several other witnesses, "The death of Abraham Lincoln is no more than the death of any nigger in the army." Where did she get that maxim if not from her church? Had not that church recently proclaimed, through her highest legal and civil authority, the devoted Roman Catholic Judge Taney in his Dred Scott decision, "The Negroes have no right which the white man is bound to respect"? By bringing the president on a level with the lowest nigger, Rome was saying that he had no right even to his life. Read in the testimony concerning Mrs. Mary E. Surratt, page 122 and 123, how the Jesuits had perfectly drilled her in the art of perjuring herself. In the very moment when the government officer orders her to prepare herself with her daughter to follow him as prisoners at about 10 p.m., Payne, the would-be murderer of Seward, knocks at the door and wants to see Mrs. Surratt. But instead of having Mrs. Surratt open the door, he finds himself confronted face-to-face with the government detective, Major Smith, who swears, "I questioned him in regard to his occupation, and what business he had at the house at this late hour of night. He stated that he was a laborer, and had come to dig a gutter at the request of Mrs. Surratt. I went to the parlor door and said, 'Mrs. Surratt, will you step here a minute?' She came out, and I asked her, 'Do you know this man, and did you hire him to come and dig a gutter for you?' She answered, raising her right hand, 'Before God, sir, I do not know this man. I have never seen him, and I did not hire him to dig a gutter for me.' But it proved after by several unimpeachable witnesses that she knew very well that Payne was a personal friend of her son, who many times had come to her house in company of his friend and pet, Booth. She had received the communion just 2 or 3 days before that public perjury. Could Jeff Davis have imparted such a religious calm and self-possession to that woman when her hands were just reddened with the blood of the president, and she was on her way to trial? No. Such calm in that soul, in such a terrible and solemn hour, could only have come from the teachings of those Jesuits who for more than 6 months were in her house, showing her a crown of eternal glory if she could help to kill the monster, apostate Lincoln, the only cause of that horrible Civil War. There is not the least doubt that the priests had perfectly persuaded Mary Surratt and Booth that the killing of Lincoln was a most holy and deserved work for which God had an eternal reward in store. There is a fact to which the American people have not yet given a sufficient attention. Without a single exception, the conspirators were Roman Catholics. The learned and great patriot, General Baker, in his admirable report, struck and bewildered by that strange and mysterious portentous fact, said, "I mention as an exceptional and remarkable fact that every conspirator in custody is by education a Catholic." Those words fell as on the ears of deaf men. It is true that some of them, as Atzeroth, Payne, and Harold, asked for Protestant ministers when they were to be hung, but on page 437 of the Trial of John Surratt, Louis Weichmann tells us that he was going to St. Aloysian's Church with Atzeroth, and that it was there that he introduced him to Mr. Brothy, another Roman Catholic. It is a well-authenticated fact that Booth and Weichmann, who were themselves Protestant perverts to Romanism, had proselytized a good number of semi-Protestants and infidels who, either from conviction or from hope of the fortunes promised to the successful murderers, were themselves very zealous for the Church of Rome. Payne, Atzeroth, and Harold were among those proselytes. But when those murderers were to appear before the country and receive the just punishment of their crime, the Jesuits were too shrewd to ignore that if they were all among the scaffold as Roman Catholics, and accompanied by their father confessors, it would at once open the eyes of the American people and clearly show that this was a Roman Catholic plot. They persuaded 3 of their proselytes to avail themselves of the theological principles of the Church of Rome, that a man is allowed to conceal his religion, may even say that he is a heretic, a Protestant, when it is for his own interest or the best interest of his church to conceal the truth and deceive the people. Here is the doctrine of Rome on that subject. It is often more to the glory of God and the good of our neighbor to cover the faith than to confess it. For example, if concealed among the heretics you may accomplish a greater amount of good, or if, by declaring our religion, more of evil would follow. For example, great trouble, death, the hostility of a tyrant. Liguri, Theologica Moralitas, page 117. Mechlin, 1845. The Jesuits had never had a reason to suspect that the declaration of their religion would damage them and excite the wrath of their tyrant, the American people. Lloyd's, in whose house Mrs. Surratt concealed the carbine which Booth wanted for protection, when just after the murder he was to flee towards the southern states, was a firm Roman Catholic. Dr. Mudd, at whose place Booth stopped to have his broken leg dressed, was a Roman Catholic. And so was Garrett, in whose barn Booth was caught and killed. Why so? Because Jeff Davis was the only man to pay $1 million to those who would kill Abraham Lincoln. The Jesuits were the only men to select the murderers and prepare everything to protect them after their diabolical deed. And such murderers could not be found except among their blind and fanatical slaves. The great fatal mistake of the American government in the prosecution of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was to cover up the religious element of that terrible drama. But this was carefully avoided throughout the trial. Not long after the execution of the murderers, I went incognito to Washington to begin my investigation. I was not surprised to see that not a single one of the government men would discuss it with me except after I had given my word of honor that I would never mention their names. I saw with a profound distress that the influence of Rome was almost supreme in Washington. I could not find a single statesman who would dare to face the nefarious influence and fight it down. Several of the government men told me in confidence we had not the least doubt that the Jesuits were at the bottom of the great iniquity. We even figured sometimes that this would come out so clearly before the military tribunal that there would be no possibility of keeping it out of the public sight. This was not through cowardice, as you think, but through a wisdom which you ought to approve, if you cannot admire it. Had we been in days of peace, we know that with a little more pressure of the witnesses many priests would have been compromised, for Mrs. Surratt's house was their common rendezvous. It was more than probable that several of them might have been hung. But the Civil War was hardly over. The Confederacy, though broken down, was still living in millions of hearts, Murderers and formidable elements of discord were still seen everywhere, to which the hanging or exiling of those priests would have given a new life. Riots after riots would have accompanied and followed their execution. We thought we had enough of blood, fires, devastations, and bad feelings. We were all longing for days of peace. The country was in need of them. We concluded that the best interests of humanity was to punish only those who were publicly and visibly guilty, that the verdict might receive the approbation of all without creating any new bad feelings. Allow us also to tell you that there was nothing that good and great men feared so much as to arm the Protestants against the Catholics, and the Catholics against the Protestants. But if anyone has still any doubts of the complicity of the Jesuits in the murder of Abraham Lincoln, let him look at the very elaborate plan of escape prepared by the priests of Rome to save the lives of the assassins and conspirators. John Surratt was in Washington, the 14th of April, helping Booth in the perpetration of the assassination. The priest, Charles Chiniquy, swears that only a few days after the murder, John Surratt was sent to him by Father Lapierre of Montreal, that he kept him concealed in his parsonage of Saint Liboire from the end of April to the end of July. Then he took him back secretly to Father Lapierre, who kept him secreted in his own father's house under the very shadow of the Montreal bishop's palace. He swears that Father Lapierre visited Surratt often, when secreted at Saint Liboire, and that Father Chiniquy visited him at least twice a week, from the end of July to September when concealed in Father Lapierre's house in Montreal. That same father, Charles Chiniquy, swears that he accompanied John Surratt in a carriage in the company of Father Lapierre to the steamer Montreal when starting for Quebec, that Father Lapierre kept Surratt under lock during the voyage from Montreal to Quebec, and that he accompanied him disguised from the Montreal steamer to the ocean steamer Peruvian. The doctor of the steamer, Peruvian, Lia Macmillan, swears that Father Lapierre introduced him to John Surratt under the false name of McCarthy, whom he was keeping locked in his stateroom till she left Quebec for Europe, the 15th of September, 1865. But who is that Father Lapierre who takes such a tender, paternal care of Surratt? No less than the Canon Bishop Bourget of Montreal. He is the confidential man of the bishop. He lives with the bishop, eats at his table, assists him with his counsel, and receives his advice in every step of life, according to the laws of Rome. The canons are to the bishop what the arms are to the body. Now I ask, is it not evident that the bishops and the priests of Washington have trusted this murderer to the care of the bishops and priests of Montreal, that they might conceal, feed, and protect him for nearly 6 months under the very shadow of the bishop's palace? Would they have done that if they were not his accomplices? Why did they so continually remain with him day and night if they were not in fear that he might compromise them by an indiscreet word? But where will those bishops and priests of Canada send John Surratt when they find it impossible to conceal him any longer from the thousands of defectives of the United States who are ransacking Canada to find out his retreat? Who can suppose that anyone but the Pope himself and his Jesuits will protect the murderer of Abraham Lincoln in Europe? If you want to see him after he has crossed the ocean, go to Vitry, at the door of Rome, enrolled under the banners of the Pope in the 9th century company of his Zouaves under the false name of Watson. Of course, the Pope was forced to withdraw his protection over him after the government of the United States had found him there, and he was brought back to Washington to be tried. But on his arrival as a prisoner in the United States, his Jesuit father confessor whispered in his ear, "Fear not, you will not be condemned." Through the influence of a high Roman Catholic lady, 2 or 3 of the jurymen will be Roman Catholics, and you will be safe. Those who have read the 2 volumes of the trial of John Surratt know that never more evident proofs of guilt were brought against a murderer. Those jurymen were told by their father confessors that the Most Holy Father, the Pope Gregory VII, had solemnly and infallibly declared that the killing of a heretic was no murder, jure canonico. After such teachings, how could the Roman Catholic jurymen find John Surratt guilty of murder for killing the heretic Lincoln? The jury, having disagreed, no verdict could be given. The government was forced to let the murderer go unpunished. But when the irreconcilable enemies of all the rights and liberties of men were congratulating themselves on their successful efforts to save the life of John Surratt, the God of heaven was stamping again on their faces the mark of murder in such a way that all eyes will see it. Some time ago, I providentially met the Reverend Mr. F.A. Conwell at Chicago. Having known that I was in search of the facts about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, he told me that he knew of one of those facts, which might perhaps throw some light on the subject. The very day of the murder, he said, I was in the Roman Catholic village of St. Joseph, Minnesota, when at about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I was told by a Roman Catholic who was a purveyor for a great number of priests who lived in that town, where they have a monastery, that State Secretary Seward and President Lincoln had just been killed. This was told me, he said, in the presence of a most respectable gentleman called Bennett, who was not less puzzled than me. As there was no railroad lines nearer than 40 miles, nor telegraph lines nearer than 80 miles from that place, we could not see how such news was spread in that town. The next day, the 15th of April, I was at St. Cloud, a town about 12 miles distant, where there was neither railroad nor telegraph. I said to several people that I had been told in the priestly village of St. Joseph by a Roman Catholic that Abraham Lincoln and Secretary Seward had been assassinated. They answered me that they had heard nothing about it. But the next Sabbath, the 16th of April, when going to the church of St. Cloud to preach, a friend gave me a copy of a telegram sent to him on the Saturday, reporting that Abraham Lincoln and Secretary Seward had been assassinated the very day before, which was Friday the 14th at 10 p.m. But how could the Roman Catholic purveyor of the priests of St. Joseph have told me the same thing before several witnesses just 4 hours before its occurrence? I asked that gentleman if he would be kind enough to give me the fact under oath, that I might make use of it in a report I intended to publish about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and he kindly granted my request. I felt that this testimony would be much more valuable if I could corroborate by the testimonies of Messrs. Bennett and Linneman. I immediately sent a magistrate to find out if they were still living, and if they remembered the facts of the sworn declaration of Reverend Mr. Conwell. By the good providence of God, both these gentlemen were found living. Mr. Bennett was willing to give sworn testimony verifying Mr. Conwell's story. Mr. Linneman stated that he remembers when Messrs. Conwell and Bennett came to this place, St. Joseph, Minnesota, on Friday evening before the president was killed, and he asked them if they had heard about the assassinations, and they replied they had not. He told them he had heard this rumor in his store from people who came in and out, but he cannot remember from whom. I present here to the world a fact of the greatest gravity, so well authenticated that it cannot allow even the possibility of a doubt. 3 or 4 hours before Lincoln was murdered in Washington, the 14th of April, 1865, that murder was not only known by someone, but it was circulated and talked of in the streets and in the houses of the priestly and Romish town of St. Joseph, Minnesota. The fact is undeniable, the testimonies are unchallengeable, and there was no railroad nor any telegraph communications nearer than 40 or 80 miles from St. Joseph. Naturally, everyone asked, how could such news spread? Where is the source of such a rumor? Mr. Linneman, who was a Roman Catholic, tells us that he heard this from many in his store and in the streets. He does not remember the name of a single one who told him that. But when we hear this from him, we understand why he did not dare to swear upon it, and shrank from the idea of perjuring himself. For everyone feels that his memory cannot be so poor as that, when he remembers so well the names of the two strangers, Messrs. Conwell and Bennett. But if the memory of Mr. Linneman was so deficient on that subject, we can help him and tell him with mathematical accuracy. You got the news from your priests of St. Joseph. The conspiracy which cost the life of the martyred president was prepared by the priests of Washington in the house of Mary Surratt, 541 H Street. The priests of St. Joseph were often visiting Washington, and boarding probably at Mrs. Surratt's, as the priests of Washington were visiting other brother priests at St. Joseph. Those priests of Washington were in daily communication with their co-rebel priests of St. Joseph. They were their intimate friends. There was no secret among them, as there are no secrets among the priests. They are the members of the same body, the branches of the same tree. The details of the murder as the day selected for its commission were as well known among the priests of St. Joseph as they were among those of Washington. The death of Lincoln was such a glorious event for those priests. That infamous Lincoln, who had dared to fight against the Confederacy of the South after the Vicar of Christ had solemnly declared that their cause was just, legitimate, and holy, that bloody tyrant and godless and infamous man was to receive at last the just chastisement of his crimes, the 14th of April. What glorious news! How could the priests conceal such a joyful event from their bosom friend, Mr. Linneman? He was their confidential man. He was their purveyor. He was their right-hand man among the faithful of St. Joseph. They thought that they could be guilty of want of confidence in their bosom friend, if they did not tell him all about the glorious event of that great day. But of course, they requested him not to mention their names, if he would spread the joyful news among the devoted Roman Catholic people of St. Joseph. Mr. Linneman has honorably and faithfully kept his promise never to reveal their names, and today we have in our hand the authentic testimonies, signed by him, that though somebody, the 14th of April, told him that President Lincoln was assassinated, he does not know who told him that. The 14th of April, 1865, the priests of Rome knew and circulated the death of Lincoln 4 hours before its occurrence and in the Roman Catholic town of St. Joseph, Minnesota, but they could not circulate it without knowing it, and they could not know it without belonging to the band of conspirators who assassinated President Lincoln.